Hey everyone, and welcome back to Weird Encounters. Thanks so much for joining us for the show. If you're a regular, thanks for coming back. And if you just found the show, welcome to some of the weirdest encounter stories you'll ever hear. Most of our episodes feature multiple stories, but tonight's a little different. This entire episode is one amazing story that takes place over decades, and it comes from my friend and fellow researcher, author Preston Dennett's book, Inside UFOs. Taylor and his wife Karen have had multiple UFO sightings and close encounters with extraterrestrial beings. These encounters include alien abductions, medical experiments, and alien implants. This is the story of Taylor and his extraterrestrial friends. You guys sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Taylor's extraterrestrial friends. It was a warm summer evening in 1964, and 11-year-old Taylor Foster was about to disappoint his mother. She had just handed him an envelope containing the electric bill and a check, and she asked him to mail the letter at the drugstore, which was about 3 blocks down the street. The store was about to close in 10 minutes, so he had to hurry. It was an important task, and Taylor happily agreed. He enjoyed getting out of the house. He took the bill and dashed to the store. After he mailed the letter, he began the short walk back to his house. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening. Taylor was about halfway home when he noticed something very strange. Taylor said all of a sudden it was like everything was quiet. There were no more city noises. It was just like dead silence. I remember looking around. In fact, I stopped and kind of looked around because I thought how strange this was. The Foster's home was located along a fairly busy 2-lane highway in a densely populated section of St. Louis, Missouri. Taylor knew there should be traffic on the road, but yet it was bizarrely empty. Suddenly, Taylor was seized by a strong impulse to look up. When I looked up, he says, I couldn't see any of the stars like I had before. As I stared, all I could see was the bottom of this object. There was kind of a grid-like pattern on the bottom. I could tell it was a vehicle, some kind of craft or something. And I thought, well, this is strange. Taylor estimated that the object was about 40 feet directly overhead. He was standing next to a 3-story apartment building, and the object hovered just above the top. He couldn't discern its shape or size, only that it was so large it blotted out the entire sky above him. He had never heard of UFOs at this point, so he had no idea what he was seeing, other than that it was some type of craft. The thought mothership came to his mind, but he had no idea where this thought came from or what it meant. Without warning, he was struck with a blinding beam of blue-white light. Says Taylor, the only thing I really remember was the light. That's all I recall. And the next thing I know, I proceed home. As he began to walk home, Taylor knew that something very profound had just happened to him. But even more amazing was the way that he felt inside. Something very strange and wonderful was occurring. This is the hardest thing to explain, actually, says Taylor. I could tell something had happened to me. It was like a new awareness of myself, other people, and things. I suddenly saw, knew, and thought about myself in a clearer way. It was like not necessarily being older, but maybe being more intelligent, perhaps. I felt smarter somehow. I'm not sure how to word this. But anyway, it was certainly a big change at that very moment. I didn't really know what had happened. I went home. I was really excited. I tried to tell my mother what happened, although I didn't really know what to tell her. It was so hard to explain to her, just like it's hard to explain to you now. I remember saying something like, I feel as though a veil has been removed from my brain. The only thing she was concerned about was that I'd mailed the electric bill and why I was so late. Only after Taylor had returned home and told his mother what happened, he realized that he couldn't account for more than 1 hour of time. The experience didn't frighten him. He had such a profound feeling of enlightenment that there was no room for fear. Whatever had happened to him, it seemed to be a very good thing. In a strange way, Taylor felt like he had just made a very important connection with some very important people. Over the next few weeks, his feelings were confirmed. Taylor spontaneously recalled what had occurred during the missing hour. He recalled being taken aboard the craft where he encountered beautiful, human-looking ETs. Says Taylor, I knew something profound had happened to me. Within a few days, whenever I would think about the event, I would see a picture in my mind of tall, thin men with long blonde straight hair, shoulder length. I started recovering things. Certain things kept coming to my mind. What I realize now is I had some conversation with what I would call the Nordics. I don't remember the details. I remember the Nordics. There were 2 or 3 males, all dressed alike in a kind of uniform, or what I would call a uniform. It was black and white. They all wore their hair just alike. They all looked really similar to each other. They weren't twins, but they looked just alike. And they were very tall. They stood very straight with perfect posture. Taylor was amazed by the appearance of these beings. They were all very handsome and very friendly. At this point, the beings had held a long conversation with Taylor, though he's unable to remember what they said. Says Taylor, I knew we had conversations, but I just can't remember what they were. I just remember things were lit up pretty bright, pretty clean. I just don't have a lot of details. I felt a real closeness to them, like they were my best friends. More than friends, like family. It's just really hard to explain. I don't know what they did to me. It was definitely a positive encounter. The encounter was not only positive, it became a major turning point in Taylor's life. Prior to the event, he had been having some trouble keeping his grades up in school. In fact, he had been having trouble for years. His difficulties actually dated back to when he was a very young toddler, at which time he began to exhibit a very bizarre trait, something Taylor now believes may be related to his relationship with the UFOs. Says Taylor, my mother always claimed that from the earliest age I spoke a language that was something other than English. At times, my mother would have to rely on my little friends, my cousin and my next-door neighbor, to know what I was saying. At first, this dilemma caused no major problems. Taylor was a shy and timid child, and he made it through kindergarten and first grade with few difficulties. In second grade, however, he was sent to the speech therapist several times before his speech problems finally disappeared completely. Unfortunately, third grade would prove to be a disaster. Taylor disliked the teacher and had little interest in schoolwork. Instead, he spent much of his time playing baseball, riding his bike, and hanging out at the local house that was allegedly haunted. He never saw any ghosts there. In fact, strangely, says Taylor, I don't recall much of anything of my time spent there. For whatever reason, Taylor failed third grade. The next 2 years, he barely passed. It was then that his mother decided Taylor should attend private school. By coincidence, this decision was made immediately following Taylor's missing time encounter. To his mother's delight, Taylor began earning straight A's. The improvement remained permanent, and Taylor was not only caught up with his classmates, he rose to the top of his class, where he remained up through college. His mother, of course, attributed the improvement to the new private school. Taylor, however, knew the real reason. It was because of his encounter with his space friends. By this time, he had concluded that he had in fact been inside the UFO, where he had made friends with human-looking extraterrestrials. It seems like science fiction, except that it's true. This event changed my life forever, says Taylor. I credit it with who I am today. It set the tone for the rest of my life. I cannot stress enough that it was a life-changing event. I suddenly had an insatiable desire to learn, to read and read. After reading our set of encyclopedias, my mother couldn't keep me out of the public library. The intimate and enlightened feeling of that encounter persisted strongly for several years. It was a magical time in Taylor's life, and he basked in the after effects. During the next 3 years, several other interesting incidents happened. In 1965 and 1966, a huge flurry of sightings occurred directly over St. Louis. Says Taylor, my parents and I used to go outside in the evening and watch them. They'd come across the city in waves. They were just bright lights in the sky. Sometimes they would be 20 or 30 at a time. Sometimes they would be in formation. Sometimes they wouldn't be. If they were in formation, sometimes 2 or 3 would break off and do all kinds of crazy acrobatic stuff. They would put on a real show, zigzagging and hot-dogging in the sky. It was just a thing that my family did at the time, and a lot of other families as well. It was kind of common. For most people, looking at UFOs was interesting. perhaps even thrilling. But for Taylor, the connection went much deeper than that. Although I didn't talk about them to other people, explains Taylor, they really became a part of my life. I felt a oneness and a closeness to them that I cannot explain to this day. There was one other incident that Taylor didn't think was significant. At the time, it was a complete mystery. In retrospect, of course, he now realizes it was an extremely important event. The incident occurred when Taylor's aunt decided to hold a family reunion. Taylor and his parents arrived early so Taylor could play with his cousins. His aunt had just bought a new swing set for her daughter, so all the kids converged on it. As Taylor climbed around with the other kids, it happened. Says Taylor, I was hanging from my knees upside down and I felt something kind of dislodged from my nose. I could feel something. I wanted it out, whatever it was, but I didn't want to pick my nose in front of my cousins. So I ran around to the front of the house and pulled this thing out of my nose. I started to throw it on the ground when I realized it was kind of shiny looking. So I looked at it closer. It was kind of like a shiny cylinder. It wasn't very large, maybe a 1/4 inch. So I just threw it on the ground and went back and played. At the time I remember thinking, oh boy, they're not going to be able to find me now. Why I thought that, I have no idea. It didn't dawn on me until much later what happened. Now he believes it was an implant that had been placed inside him during his abduction 3 years earlier. At the time, for some reason, it didn't seem like a big deal. It was 1969 and Taylor was now 16 years old. Then came terrible news. His father had retired and he wanted to live in the country. His parents had decided to sell their home and move out of St. Louis. Tired of the bustling city life, they had found a farm with more than 150 acres outside a small town in Missouri. It was exactly what they were looking for. They purchased the farmhouse and told Taylor to pack up his belongings. They were moving. Taylor was not happy about it. His life was going really well and he didn't want to move. He was also worried that his UFO friends would no longer be able to find him. As he says, I was kind of fearful. I couldn't help but wonder if this would be the end of my UFO sightings. Fortunately, Taylor's new residence had some advantages. With all that acreage, there were plenty of places to explore. Behind the house was a huge field. Beyond that was a large forested area. A creek wound through the forest and led to a hidden little pond. A small dirt road led across the field, through the forest, and curved around the pond. It was one of Taylor's favorite places to hang out. It was only a few months after they moved in that Taylor experienced his second major UFO incident. One summer afternoon, he had a strong impulse to go hang out by the hidden pond in the forest behind the farm. As he walked around the road that led into the forest, he noticed two strange figures staring at him. He looked at them and thought, oh, it's just two deer, and continued walking towards the pond, and then later back home. However, over the next few weeks, he started to remember a different story. Says Taylor, this is kind of hard to explain, but at the time I thought I saw two deer. I stood there and watched them. They watched me. But it wasn't really two deer I was looking at. It was two grays. I looked around and there was a small craft to the left of me in the clearing. The two grays then led me into the UFO. The screen memory worked for a while, but I always knew that something more had occurred. Taylor was unable to remember anything else. He was only able to remember what he did by meditating intensely on the incident. He wasn't frightened by what happened. In a way, he felt a special relationship with the UFO and the ETs. It certainly wasn't a negative encounter. At age 16, Taylor was coming to realize that for whatever reason, extraterrestrials were very interested in him. His next encounter occurred exactly 1 year later in the summer of 1970. Again, one afternoon, he felt the impulse to go hang out by the pond. As he approached the curve in the road, he saw a white figure through the trees, hovering a few feet above the road. Says Taylor, I thought it was a female. That was my impression. It was something very alien. I can't describe it very well. I think maybe it was a gray, but I don't know for sure. As I walked around the road, I could get a better look at it. It was something up in the air. It wore a white tunic or a dress. It was hovering. It didn't have any legs or feet touching the ground. I remember walking up to it. I couldn't even tell you exactly what it looked like. I remember walking up to it and having a conversation. She conversed with me, but about what, I have no idea. Immediately after the incident, Taylor walked away convinced that he had had some close-up encounter with an unusually large owl. Over the next 24 hours, however, the screen memory, which was already weak and tenuous, collapsed under the weight of the actual incident, which flooded forth in Taylor's mind, though not in complete detail. Again, Taylor was surprised, but not afraid. He was more intrigued than fearful. He had already had 3 incredible encounters. He was beginning to wonder what might happen next. As it turned out, he didn't have to wait long. It was a hot summer weekend in 1971, and the house was filled with Taylor's relatives. Taylor's older brother had came to visit with his wife and children. It was Sunday afternoon, and most of the kids were outside playing. Suddenly, someone shouted out, "What's that?" Everyone came running outside. Hovering just above the trees on the far end of the 60-acre field behind the house was a silver, metallic, saucer-shaped object. Multicolored lights moved in rhythm around its perimeter. Everyone looked up at the object in awe. Taylor's nephews jumped up on the barbecue pit and picnic table to get a better look. His father didn't seem to be paying any attention. Taylor and his mother stood on the back porch. As the UFO hovered there, an idea suddenly popped into Taylor's head. He had a .22 rifle with a powerful scope mounted on it. He could use it to get a closer look at the object. Taylor ran back inside, grabbed the rifle, and ran back outside. Says Taylor, "The UFO was still there. I brought the rifle up to my shoulder and looked through the scope, and it was gone. I thought maybe I just can't get it in my field of vision, so I pulled the rifle down. I looked up with my naked eye, and it was gone." Taylor hoped the UFO people didn't think he was going to shoot at them. That wasn't his intention. Disappointed, he went back inside and returned the rifle. When he returned outside, he got the single most incredible shock of his life. Says Taylor, "I went back outside and everyone was still standing in the same position as before. They all had their backs to me as if they were still watching the UFO, which I could see was gone. And I thought that was a little bit odd, but I didn't think too much of it. So I walked off the deck and started walking around the house. Then I realized everyone was frozen, still staring at the same place as they were before. It was like time had stood still for them, but not for me. And when I got around to the end of the house, I could see my father. He was in mid-stride carrying a bucket. I can't remember if the bucket had milk or water in it, but even the droplets were frozen in time as they splashed over the top of the bucket. Taylor's eyes widened. At the time, it was almost impossible for him to comprehend what was happening. Why was everybody frozen? What happened to his father? It couldn't be a practical joke. His father was not the type. He felt a rising panic. Says Taylor, "I thought, well, this is really, really weird. This is really odd." Then he got another bad shock. Looking up, he saw that the UFO had not left. Instead, it was now landed directly in the garden at the front edge of the property, about 50 feet from the house. It was a dull metallic gray and all the lights were off. In front of the UFO, walking directly towards him, were 3 short figures, which Taylor now recognizes as the stereotypical grays. They were approximately 4 feet tall, says Taylor. Large heads, black eyes, shiny bodies, long arms, and skinny legs. I couldn't tell if they had any clothes on or not. Certainly nothing shiny. It was just 3 grays walking towards me. And that's all I remember. The next thing I know, everybody just sort of woke up and started doing what they were doing. Nobody said a word about the UFO or anything. When everybody suddenly became unfrozen, Taylor didn't know what to think. And when nobody mentioned the UFO, neither did he. In fact, 3 days passed before he pieced together what had happened. He approached his mother and said, "Do you remember seeing that UFO the other day?" She looked at him with surprise. "Oh yeah," she replied. "I do remember that." Unfortunately, that's all she remembered. While everybody remembered the UFO hovering over the tree line at the far end of the field, nobody remembered that it landed and 3 gray extraterrestrials exited the craft. It was Taylor's 4th experience with missing time, at least that he was aware of. On this occasion, however, he had no recall whatsoever of what happened during the missing hours. In fact, it took him a few days to actually piece together what he did remember. After each of these encounters, it was like a blanket of amnesia covered the events. In fact, he feels that they were probably events that he's still unable to recall, even today. He has no idea why he remembered seeing the grays when nobody else did. But it did reinforce in his mind the fact that he was the central focus or the reason behind the visitations. Again, for some reason, the ETs were very interested in him. He wasn't exactly sure why or what their agenda with him was. He did come away from his earlier encounters, however, with some unusual ideas. Says Taylor, "During this time, I felt that a great calamity was going to befall the human race, and I felt that I was somehow going to help lead the people to safety. This seemed crazy to me. Why would adults want to follow me? And besides, where was I going to lead them? I didn't know." As time went on, the UFOs continued to appear to him on a regular basis, as if to remind him that they were still around. Taylor graduated high school, and in 1972, he began his first year in college. 1 year into his studies, he had his next encounter. On this occasion, he had another witness. He and another student discovered that they were neighbors, so they began to carpool. One morning at 6:45, they were on their way to campus when they saw a bright shooting star-like object. Suddenly, it did something that no shooting star can do. Taylor explains, "While watching it in a steep downward trajectory, it seemed to stop dead in its tracks. This would have been in the vicinity of the Mississippi River. After a few seconds, it shot upwards and out of sight. We were awed. That same afternoon on the way home from school, we had the radio on, and the news reported a UFO early this morning over the Mississippi River. We knew then that had to be what we had seen. There they were again, his UFOs." Taylor had the distinct impression that whoever was inside the UFO was aware of him, and that again they were reminding him of their relationship. Around this time, he happened to see the film The UFO Incident, which featured the UFO abduction of Betty and Barney Hill by the Gray-type ETs. He thought that the movie was interesting, but he was a little surprised that it was kind of scary. His experiences, on the other hand, had not caused him any real fear. He thought to himself that his aliens must be a different species. Taylor continued his college studies, eventually specializing in chiropractic medicine. While he had a few minor sightings over the next few years, they were mostly of distant lights. It wasn't until 1980, at age 27, that the UFOs made another dramatic appearance. On this occasion, he was driving with his mother and his 8-year-old niece to southern Arkansas where they had relatives. It was about midnight. While the traffic wasn't busy, there were a few other cars on the highway. At first, all three of them rode in the front bench seat, but then Taylor's niece climbed into the back seat so she could lie down. Without warning, a bright light appeared ahead of the car on the opposite side of the highway. Says Taylor, "I first thought it was a spotlight on top of a small building just off the side of the road. I was driving 80 miles an hour, and yet I was not catching up to this light. It just stayed in the distance." "Do you see that light?" Taylor's mom asked. "Yes," Taylor replied. "Why aren't we catching up to it?" "I don't know," Taylor said. His niece heard the conversation, and she sat up in the back seat to peer at the light. At this point, the light suddenly slowed down. The car began to close distance, and in a few minutes they had caught up with the object, which continued to pace them. The three witnesses looked over to their left. Now they could see that the one light was actually 4 lights. Says Taylor, "Directly across from the interstate, traveling just above the tree level, were 4 round lights, 2 on the bottom and 2 on the top. They moved as one unit. The lights appeared to be at least 20 or 30 feet across. And while they moved as one unit, he could not tell if they were connected or not." At this point, Taylor's niece became nervous and she climbed onto the front seat, sandwiching herself between Taylor and his mother. It was clear to all of them that they were being observed and followed. Then Taylor got an idea. He told his mom, "I'm going to try something." Says Taylor, "I dropped my speed down to 40. The UFO did the same. And then I'd go up to 80, and it would get up to 80. Then I'd back off, and it would back off. It was going perfectly parallel to us. We traveled a little further, and it slowed down and dropped to the ground level behind some trees. I thought, well, that's the end of it. When suddenly, it was right back up with us again. It did that 2 or 3 times, where it would just drop down behind the trees. It was so weird. This cat and mouse game went on until we reached the suburbs of Pine Bluff. It stopped, and of course, we went on." Taylor's niece was now scared half to death. Taylor, however, was thrilled by the encounter. As he says, my mom and I had seen a lot of UFOs by this time, but this was something totally new to us. To me, this incident was a highlight of a close encounter of the first kind. I had witnesses, and it appeared to be reacting directly to my vehicle's speed. It was very exciting for all of us. The above sighting, while exciting, was still only a sighting. Around the same time as this sighting, Taylor had another encounter that was much more extreme. Recently, he had been wondering about how the UFO occupants were able to withstand the incredible gravitational forces that they must be subjected to while maneuvering their vehicles at right angles with instant accelerations to thousands of miles per hour and then stopping on a dime. Specifically, Taylor was wondering how humans would be able to survive such a thing. It was sometime in the middle of the night when he woke up to find himself surrounded by gray-type beings inside a UFO, says Taylor. There were 3 grays there. The inside of the vehicle was round. Everything was clean and put up very well. And there was a transparent, plastic-looking chair. It looked like acrylic. You could see right through it. And it was molded for a human form. There was a place to put your arms and legs. They telepathically instructed me to sit in the chair. I asked what the purpose of the chair was, as it was obviously for humans and not for them. They told me this was how humans were able to travel with them to survive the G-forces that their craft produced. I sat in the chair and put my arms in the molded armrests. It was pretty comfortable. The next thing I know, from out of the ceiling came this other half of the chair, the front half. It fit right over the top of me and fastened to the half I was sitting on, and latched. At this point, I was completely sealed and enclosed in this chair, but I could see out as the entire chair was a clear plastic-type substance. And I thought, okay, this is different. Then I heard a swooshing sound like water running, and I quickly realized that this enclosed chair that I was in was filling up with a warm liquid. I remember telling myself not to get excited, not to lose my composure, but then it began to fill up higher and higher, and I began to get kind of scared. I thought, what are they going to do, drown me in this thing? No sooner had I thought this when they telepathically told me, do not worry, and to breathe. You're going to be okay. Just breathe. Breathe. They kept telling me to breathe and that it would be okay. I thought, what do you mean, breathe? I held my breath like anybody would do. They're still telling me, just breathe, it's okay, just breathe. Finally, I had no choice but to breathe. I took in a big gulp, and to my surprise, I found that I could still breathe. Taylor allowed himself to relax slightly. Now he understood what the ETs were doing. They were showing him how they were able to transport humans aboard their craft. He speculated that he was breathing some sort of oxygenated liquid. His memory of the experience ended there. He only recalled seeing the chair aboard the craft. He had no recall of either entering or leaving the craft. When he woke up the next morning, he instantly remembered the event. He wondered if it might have been a dream. It certainly seemed possible. The problem was, it was not at all like a normal dream. Normally, he didn't remember his dreams until he woke up. He remembered this event, however, as it was occurring. Also, the experience was very, very vivid and very real, not at all like a dream. It felt real. On the other hand, Taylor found it more comfortable to refer to his experience as a dream because it was easier to deal with psychologically. He was still having some trouble accepting the fact that he was being followed and even abducted by UFOs wherever he went. Realizing that his experiences were unusual, he started to keep a journal. At the same time, life kept him very busy. He built a new home and began to set up his own chiropractic practice. He then sold his home and purchased another home near his parents. He continued to see occasional distant UFOs. By this time, it was clear that the area where he lived was definitely a UFO hotspot. They certainly were not the only people who were seeing these UFOs. Most of these craft, however, did not respond or interact with them. Still, some of the sightings were dramatic enough to cause Taylor some concern. One afternoon in 1986, Tyler was in his bedroom changing his clothes when he heard the sound of a jet roaring directly outside his home. He dashed to the window and looked out, says Taylor. To my surprise, I saw a jet fighter in the sky, and some distance in front of him, the sun glinted off a silvery object that was the classical flying saucer shape. The object then accelerated and left the jet in its dust. The year of 1986 also brought a new phenomenon: waves of unmarked black helicopters. The town where they lived was very rural. It was at least 50 miles away from any military bases and had very little conventional air traffic. It was very unusual to see a helicopter traveling only a few hundred feet above the ground. There was no reason for anyone, especially military, to be in that area. And yet, on numerous occasions, Taylor observed unmarked black helicopters, sometimes singly, sometimes in groups of up to 4, crossing over the area. He's not sure, however, if it had anything to do with his own UFO situation. Meanwhile, more scattered sightings occurred. Taylor's next really spectacular sighting occurred in 1993. He'd gone out to eat with a girlfriend. They had ordered sandwiches at a local fast food joint and were sitting in the back parking lot eating their food and admiring the panoramic view of the valley spread out below them. The valley was a very rural area, with mostly trees and fields and a few scattered homes. It was dusk and only a few of the structures had turned on their lights. Suddenly, they both noticed a round formation of multicolored lights sitting alone on the valley floor. They first thought that it was another building or structure, except that it looked so strange. First, it was perfectly round and larger than most of the structures around. Second, it had different colored lights around the entire circumference. Says Taylor, "We began discussing this when suddenly it began to rise straight up off the ground. It did this very slowly until it was about 300 to 500 feet above the ground. Then it slowly glided away from us until it was finally out of sight." Taylor and his friend looked at each other in awe. It was yet another UFO. After the above sighting, Taylor began seeing UFOs regularly. Rarely would more than a month or two go by without having some type of encounter. Taylor's UFO journal now numbers more than 200 pages. Most of these sightings have few new details and are actually somewhat ordinary. While Taylor's sightings have been frequent and regular, only a handful of these have been close-up or interactive encounters. One such incident in 1994. One evening at about dusk, Taylor went out to the local post office to drop off some letters. "I was pulling up the mailbox and I noticed this really intensely bright light in the sky. It was so bright, and there was so much power coming off of it, it was hard to look at it. You know how a snow cone has the point on the bottom and the ice being the ball on the top? Well, this had a point of energy coming off the top and bottom. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing was just gone." In 1995, Taylor met the woman who would later become his wife. At the time they were dating, he asked her if she believed in UFOs. Karen replied, "No, I don't really believe in them." "Well, have you ever seen one?" "No." "Well, you know," Taylor told her, "if I'd never seen one, I wouldn't believe in them either. But if we're going to be together, you will be seeing them." Karen narrowed her eyes and replied hesitantly, "Okay." She didn't know what to think of her new boyfriend's announcement. She hadn't really thought much about UFOs, but she had no problems if Taylor believed in them. As far as herself, she would have to wait and see. As Taylor predicted, she didn't have to wait long. One evening, Taylor took her outside of his home and pointed out the UFOs. Karen was stunned to see that Taylor was right. Some sightings occurred during the day involving rectangular and triangular shaped objects that would appear high overhead and then dart away quickly. More often, however, the sightings involved anomalous star-like lights, usually at night. On many occasions, the objects would approach closely, hovering treetop level. On these occasions, the craft shape was obvious, and Taylor and Karen often observed rings of blinking colored lights around the ships. On some instances, the objects would change into different shapes. Other times, a single object would divide and multiply into 2 or more objects. Says Karen, "I've seen things like that. I've seen balls of light where it looked like there was 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and then it would just disappear." Within a few years of meeting him, Taylor had already shown her dozens of strange objects that did not behave like any conventional aircraft. She had no choice but to be convinced. For whatever reason, her soon-to-be husband was being followed by UFOs. Says Karen, "I tell people, if you want to see something, just hang around Taylor. I mean, we have friends who didn't believe. And when they got to know Taylor, they had some pretty good sightings. He's very in tune with them." Meanwhile, the UFO sightings continued fast and furious. Throughout the spring of 1996, they were seeing UFOs on nearly a nightly basis. One night during this time, Taylor stepped out to look at the objects. On this occasion, there were several objects, which wasn't that unusual. What was interesting, however, was that one of the objects was very close. Taylor showed it to Karen. She replied, "Why don't we get in the car and see how close we can get to it?" "Sure, let's do it," Taylor said. Taylor and Karen piled into the car and took off towards the object. Almost immediately, it changed direction and started drifting lazily towards town. Taylor and Karen quickly closed the distance until they approached within a few hundred yards of the object. Says Taylor, "It was all lit up. It was kind of the shape of a football, but it was all lit up and you really couldn't make out any details because the light was so bright. The object picked up speed and headed directly towards town. As they entered into the city limits, both Taylor and Karen lost sight of the object. As they lived in a small town with a population of about 5,000, they decided to continue through town to the other side. When they got to the north edge of town, they parked the car, got out and looked around to see if the UFO was still around. As if on cue, the object appeared, heading directly towards them. Says Taylor, "It came from right over treetop level, only about 30 feet high, and we were probably 150 feet away from it. It was doing maybe 2 miles an hour, just barely moving, and no sound. Again, it was the shape of a football. It was all lit up. In fact, we were that close. I was really looking hard at it, trying to see some kind of details through the light, and I just couldn't come up with any details on it. As the object was moving slowly, they ran back into the car and followed it. As if it were playing cat and mouse, the UFO now veered west and was leading them down a remote gravel road. After another half hour of this, Taylor realized that the UFO was giving them a wild goose chase." Says Karen, "It seemed like the more we got close to it, the further it went." Taylor turned to his wife and said, "Enough's enough. It's getting late. We got to get home. We've got to go to work tomorrow, and this thing will lead us anywhere." Karen agreed. The direction they were heading was becoming increasingly rural and remote. They stopped at the next driveway to turn around. As soon as they stopped, so did the object. They got out of the car and looked at it with binoculars. Through the binoculars, they could still see only the single glowing white football shape. As the UFO wasn't doing anything, they got back in the car and returned back towards town. Karen, however, kept an eye on the object. A few seconds later, she shouted out, "It's following us." Taylor looked, and sure enough, it was pacing their vehicle off to the side. As they drove into town, they were shocked to see the object fearlessly following them. It scooted right over the local Walmart, and then, when they stopped at the signal light, the object hovered directly over the nearby gas station. As they drove out of town, the UFO continued to follow them home. Karen became very excited and kept peering out of the various car windows to keep the object in sight. When they finally got home, the object pulled back and darted away quickly. However, it wasn't until 1997 that Karen had her first major close-up encounter. They had spent the day in St. Louis and were starting the nearly 3-hour drive home. It was dusk as they began to leave the city. Suddenly, Karen spotted a round, bright, orange-yellow light hovering at about tree level off in the distance. She pointed it out to Taylor. He just shrugged. It took them about a half an hour to reach the main interstate. The object paced their car off in the distance the entire way. When they reached the interstate, it was now dark. At this point, the object rose higher up. For the next hour, the object continued to follow their car. There were many other cars moving up and down the highway, but nobody else seemed to notice or react to the strange light. Convinced that that was unusual, Karen kept her eyes glued to the object. As she says, it was at treetop level. To me, it seemed like it was pretty big, and it was bright, and it just kind of followed us. I kept watching it. I wouldn't take my eyes off of it, because I wanted to make sure that what I was seeing was really what I was seeing. Suddenly, she saw something amazing. She turned to Taylor and said, "You know what? I see 6 little lights up there in the sky besides the big one." Without thinking, Taylor replied, "Well, keep your eye on all of them. Maybe they'll go into the big one." About 10 seconds later, each of the tiny little objects converged and disappeared into the big one. The object continued to follow them for the next hour. Finally, they came upon their exit. At the exact moment that they drove onto the exit ramp, the object rose up the level of the ramp and darted away. Says Taylor, "It just shot tremendously fast, just boom, and gone with lightning speed. It left and we never saw it again. It was just gone. But it followed us from St. Louis." On the evening of February 22nd, 2004, Taylor had one of his strangest sightings to date. Taylor had just returned home from work and was finishing dinner. His neighbor, who lives a half a mile down the road, called up Taylor. Knowing his interest in UFOs, his neighbor said, "You need to come up here right now and see what we're looking at." "What is it?" Taylor asked. "I don't know," his neighbor said. "It's really weird." Taylor hopped in his car and drove over. When he arrived, his neighbors were outside looking up at a bright object that hovered low in the sky just over the southern section of town. It was an orange-red spherical-shaped object with apparent brightness several times that of the brightest star. As they watched, the center of the object began to swirl and became transparent. At the same time, another bright star-like object appeared directly above it. Now the orange-red light became a perfect ring of light, reminding Taylor of some kind of a wormhole. After a few minutes, the star-like object disappeared and the orange ring dissolved. His neighbor was astonished. She had never seen a UFO until she met Taylor. Now she had seen several, and the sightings were getting stranger. On another later occasion, Taylor was again followed home by one of the objects. Even after he arrived home, the object remained hovering nearby. He decided to call his neighbor, and she asked him to let her know if any of the UFOs were heading her way. Taylor's neighbor said, "You've got a flashlight. Why don't you go out there and flash your flashlight at it a couple of times and see if it does anything?" Taylor agreed. He took his flashlight, went outside, and aimed it at the UFO and turned it on. The flashlight turned on for only a second before the battery suddenly died. Taylor told his neighbor what happened. She said, "Well, it followed you all the way home. Why don't you get in your car and drive over here to my house and see if it follows you over here?" Taylor liked the idea. He got his wife and they drove over to the neighbor's home. To their delight, the UFO followed. When they arrived at their neighbor's, she was outside and she could see the UFO. By 2004, Karen had seen UFOs dozens of times. However, she had never had any encounters with ETs themselves, nor had they shown any interest in her. Then one evening, Taylor woke up to find a gray in his bedroom. To his concern, it was only interested in his wife. Says Taylor, "I woke up and there was a gray standing on the side of the bed next to my wife. I looked at it, and it was a gray color. My first thought was, am I looking at a ghost? Then it dawned on me. That's a gray. It had a big head. Telepathically, it told me that I was dreaming and to go back to sleep as nothing harmful would come to her. It said to me, lie back down and go to sleep. Everything is okay." And like a good subject, I thought, yeah, okay, she'll be okay. So I lay back down. Then thought, wait a minute, I've got to look at this. I rose back up and the gray was still there, but he was leaning over my wife. All I could see was the top of its round, bald head. And I remember thinking, okay, everything is all right. And I went back to sleep. Taylor told his wife the next morning. She was a little upset and told Taylor that next time, he should at least tell the gray to leave her alone. This may have been good advice. Shortly later, Karen had a nighttime experience that made her realize that she, like her husband, was now also deeply involved with UFOs. Karen woke up and was surprised to find that her pajama bottoms and her underwear had been removed. She had gone to sleep wearing them as she always does. Never before had this happened, says Karen. It was weird. I thought it was kind of strange. Because I'm 52 years old and I've always went to bed with my pajamas on. After Taylor woke up, she shared her story and said, "You know, it's the weirdest thing. This is not normal." Taylor kind of shrugged. I didn't know what to say, says Taylor. I didn't really associate it with anything at the moment. I just thought, I don't know. Later that day, Karen noticed a strange mark on her abdomen. It was a nickel-sized bruise with a puncture in the center of it. It wasn't painful, but it certainly looked unusual. That evening, she told Taylor about the mark and asked him what he thought. Taylor looked at the bruise. It slowly dawned on him what it meant. I just wasn't really putting all this together. I guess I should have, but I just wasn't. And when I looked at it, then I got really upset and shooken up because it was right over her left ovary. I was really upset because she had never had any encounters until she met me. I felt like her association with me was bringing this on. But what do I do? Taylor felt a strong wave of guilt sweep over him. Karen was obviously also upset, but there was little he could do but comfort her as best as possible. After about 2 weeks, the mark on her abdomen healed. However, Karen did experience one other strange symptom. I remember when my monthly came, I bled and bled and bled. A lot. I've always been regular, and I've never had any problems. And I thought that was kind of strange. A few months later, in August of 2004, Karen woke up to find a nickel-sized bruise on her right breast. She had no idea how the bruise got there, nor did Taylor remember anything. They both attribute the bruise to the obvious cause, the ETs. By this time, Taylor had read a few books about UFOs and alien abductions. Much of what he read about sounded familiar. With such a strong connection to ETs, Taylor decided to try an experiment. While in meditation, he sent out a telepathic message to the ETs and asked them how they were able to walk through solid walls. A few days later, Taylor woke up one evening to find 3 grays in his bedroom. They proceeded to give him a demonstration of how they moved through the walls. Says Taylor, "I was on my side looking outside the wall, which was about 5 feet away from me. I woke up just in time to see the wall dissolve, and I could see through the wall. I could see the trees and stars through a hole. It was like there was just no wall there. Where there was a wall, there was nothing. Then you move over a little bit and there was this foggy looking stuff, and then you could see the wall. I was thinking, this is really weird because there's supposed to be a dresser there. And where's the dresser? That's what I was thinking. About that time, in walks 3 grays. They just walked or floated right into the room, marching in single file. They walked down to the end of the bed, lined up in a row at the end, and that's all I remember." A few days later, the ETs gave another even more impressive demonstration. Says Taylor, "I woke up in the middle of the night. I was on my bed, so I was looking straight up when the ceiling began to dissolve. Again, I could see the stars in the night sky. Then what I thought was a star from very high up dropped down to my rooftop level. As it descended, I could make out the shape of a craft. In the middle of the bottom of the craft was a large blue light. The blue light began to descend from the craft through the hole in the ceiling onto me and my bed. This is all I remember." 1 year later, on September 5th, 2005, Taylor had another major close encounter. For the last several years, he had suffered a small growth on his left cheek. He didn't notice it when it first appeared. One day, it was just suddenly there. It didn't cause him any pain or discomfort, nor did it seem to change. Therefore, he just left it alone. Then one evening, while getting ready for bed, Taylor was shaving his neck with a razor when he cut himself. It was a small cut, but it took him a while to stop the bleeding. He finally had to dab a piece of tissue on it. He returned to the bedroom to find his wife laying on the bed waiting for him. She saw the Kleenex on his neck. Taylor explained that he had nicked himself. Karen laughed and said, "You know what you really need to do is have something done about your face," as she pointed to the cyst on his left cheek. She was just joking, and so was Taylor when he said, "Yeah, well, it's probably just an alien implant." The two laughed again and then went to bed. At the time, they had no idea that that innocent statement would send shock waves to distant places. Sometime in the middle of the night, Taylor woke up to find himself lying on a table in a strange round room next to a familiar gray-type ET. Says Taylor, "I just remember finding myself on an examination table with a gray standing over me. I could only see the gray from the waist up, and he was scolding me like a child. He was telling me, 'This is ridiculous. I'm going to have to take that implant out. You've gone through far too many of these.'" Taylor looked at the gray with surprise, and he asked, "You mean that really was an implant?" "Yes," the gray telepathically replied. "You know I was only joking," Taylor told the gray. The gray replied, "Yes, but you put the idea in your head, and eventually you would have acted on it like you have done before." What is he talking about? Taylor wondered. Before. It wasn't until later that he remembered the object that he had fished out of his nose as a kid. At this point, the gray alien continued to perform some type of operation on the cyst. Taylor told the alien, "You don't have to take it out. It was a joke." "No," the alien replied. "We have no choice now. When we put the next one in, you'll never find it." Taylor doesn't remember much else. Again, he felt no fear. He woke up 30 minutes earlier than normal and instantly remembered the experience, thinking, could it have been a dream? "So the first thing I did was put my hand on my cheek," says Taylor, "and there was no lump. It was just gone. And I thought, maybe I'm on the wrong side. I checked the other side and it wasn't there. And I thought, this is really weird." Taylor jumped up and ran into the kitchen to find Karen. He pointed to his face where the cyst had been. "It's gone. Or is this my imagination or what?" She peered closer. "No, it's gone," she said with astonishment. Says Taylor, "I looked over it real good. There was no cut marks, nothing to show that they had removed it. However, about 3 days later, it was like the skin over it just disintegrated. It just rotted away. It was strange." Around this time, Taylor and Karen noticed strange poltergeist activity in their home. On several occasions, they both heard someone calling out their names. They've also heard other strange noises, such as phantom footsteps going up and down the stairs or sudden loud banging noises. On one occasion, they heard a strange swishing sound coming from the living room, When they ran to the room, they saw the doily, which normally sits under the teacups on the end table, had been mysteriously moved onto the floor without disturbing the teacups. They replaced the doily and continued watching television in the other room. 5 minutes later, they heard the same sound. They rushed into the living room again, and the doily was on the floor. It was the same as before, except one major difference. This time, the entire room was engulfed by a powerful rotten egg smell. Karen replaced the doily again and went to bed. Taylor stayed awake a little longer. Eventually, the smell faded, and he went to bed. A few months later, Karen's brother came to visit, and the subject of the strange activity came up. Karen's brother wanted to hold a seance to see if there truly was an invisible presence in the house. Taylor, however, did not want to aggravate what might already be a volatile situation. As they argued about the issue, suddenly the kitchen door opened and slammed shut, says Taylor. We ran into the kitchen to check the door to see if maybe someone had come in, or someone was here, but there weren't. So I said to her brother, well, I think you got your answer. You wanted to know if something's here. Well, obviously something's here. That ended all discussion of any seance, though it wasn't long before some weird events occurred. On 2 occasions, Taylor saw what looked like an apparition of a dog in the hallway. On another occasion, their son and his wife came to visit. They planned to sleep in the basement, but shortly after they were down there, she claimed to have seen the shadow of a person who promptly disappeared. She refused to sleep in the basement and instead was given an upstairs room. However, in the middle of the night, Taylor woke up to hear strange commotion in the adjacent room where they slept. In the morning, he had found out that the wife had woken up in the middle of the night to find little lights beneath the covers. She leaped out of bed and woke her husband. He woke up and also saw the lights, which promptly disappeared. Another recent sighting occurred in late 2006. Taylor was driving home when he came upon a pickup truck stopped in the middle of the road. The 2 people inside were staring up at a bright, lighted object that was maneuvering in tight circles overhead. They drove away as Taylor approached, while he got out of his car and watched the object until it suddenly zipped away. More sightings of red, green, and blue lights occurred in 2006. The sightings no longer surprised Taylor. As he says, I saw one the other day off the interstate. It was hovering over the creek and I never even thought of stopping, as crazy as that sounds. It had a double row of windows, one on top of the other. It was shaped like a top. My wife and I drove right by it. We slowed down, we looked at it, and just kept going. Taylor still does not know why he's had so many encounters. He does admit that the area where they live has a lot of mines, and that perhaps might be a factor. He has talked to too many local residents who have also reported seeing UFOs. While it's clear that Taylor's area is a hotbed, this is definitely not the explanation for Taylor's high number of encounters. For example, often when he and Karen travel out of state, they have numerous sightings. Recently, he visited California and sighted an unusual object with multicolored lights hovering in place. As they drove closer to it, it suddenly winked out, as if turning off the lights. On another occasion, they were driving along the 5 freeway in Southern California. As they passed the nuclear power station, north of Camp Pendleton, Karen spotted a silver flying saucer-shaped craft, hovering directly over the power plant. She pointed it out to Taylor and their other passengers. They all saw it glinting in the afternoon sunlight. Unfortunately, as they were on the highway, they were unable to stop. Why does Taylor have so many UFO encounters? This, of course, is the million-dollar question that has been on Taylor's mind ever since his ordeal began. One possible reason for his encounters, Taylor speculates, is his family connection. Both his parents had multiple sightings, some of these prior to Taylor being born. Both his parents have always believed very strongly in the existence of UFOs. On the other hand, neither of them reported any kind of face-to-face extraterrestrial encounters like Taylor's. Then again, Taylor has kept his close encounter stories secret from pretty much everyone except for his wife. His family and friends know that Taylor has seen many UFOs, but little else. One day, Taylor went to visit one of his second cousins. To his shock, her home was plastered with countless stickers and other representations of numerous gray-type ETs. He didn't feel comfortable asking her about them, but it made him wonder, could she be having experiences too? Obviously, she was interested. There are other strange connections that Taylor still doesn't fully understand. He admits to having several unusual medical abnormalities and wonders if there was some type of relationship there with the UFOs. For example, he's had problems with his eyes, including dry eye syndrome and another much more rare condition. As a child, all of his baby teeth had roots like adult teeth. His hearing is ultra-sensitive, making loud noises almost unbearable. Also, during one visit to his physician, his surprised doctor told Taylor that his spine contained an extra lumbar vertebrae. It seemed that every time he went for a physical examination, the doctor would find another peculiarity about his physiology. Meanwhile, Taylor and his wife continued to have UFO sightings on literally a daily basis. One such sighting occurred in October of 2006. It was 8:45 in the evening when Taylor noticed the familiar UFO lights. Says Taylor, "I went out the front door the other night and there was one kind of behind the trees to the southeast of us. And it was just stationary in the sky and it was pulsating white, green, blue, and red lights. This is what we see a lot. We see a lot of those peculiar things." While Taylor enjoys seeing UFOs, he likes it even better when he has witnesses, which usually means his wife. Taylor called out, "Hey Karen, there's one out front. Do you want to come look at it?" "Well, I'm reading the paper right now," she replied. "I'll be out there in a minute." Taylor returned into the house and did a few chores. 15 minutes later, they went outside. Says Taylor, "It was still there, but it had changed locations. So we looked at it for maybe a minute or so, and then went back into the house. We checked again at about 10 o'clock, and it was gone."